Oopsie. Hi, Chandini.
Hi.
Is your audio on?
Yeah.
Hello.
Wait, can you hear me now?
Hi, guys. Can you both talk for a second, please?
Can you hear me?
Okay.
Yeah. Hi. Is it?
Hi. Your hair, everyone's hair looks so
Hi.
nice. So we do have attendees on.
Oh yeah, I actually washed
A novel I'm going to put mine down.
Oh.
You're crazy
Okay.
here. You washed your hair. It looks amazing. I am. So we have one attendee who I've talked to a few times. So hi, Monica. I'm going to minimize the screen. I can read my intro right at 5, and then off we go.
Okay. And
so we'll just wait for everyone to come in. Oh, share screen.
Should I do that, or were you
yes.
going to? Okay.
Can you do that? You're good?
Yes. I need you to make me the co-host, or enable. It's saying host disabled attendee screen sharing. So I think
you're now the co-host.
Oh.
That's good.
There we go.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
Tell me when you can see it. It says loading.
Yep, it's loading. It'll take a minute. Perfect. Okay, I'm going to minimize this so I can see my intro. Oops.
Hey, Gail. An option here saying that I can allow attendees to talk. Can I
Okay,
try it out to see if we can do?
sure.
Okay, I'm gonna
You could say,
I'm
ask,
gonna allow.
my mom is on. You can ask, just say Chuck. Call my mom Chuck. But let's see if her, oh, you have to click allow to talk.
Yeah. So it's saying that Charlotte,
Here,
can
I can
you?
unmute her.
I just want
Here.
to see because that'd be really nice if we can let people
Yeah.
talk.
Mom, can you say hi?
Hi.
Okay.
Cool.
Okay. So do you want me to unmute to ask everyone to allow to talk? Would that help, Sarah?
If I stay, I can just, if someone has a question, I could unmute them as if they ask to.
Fine. Okay, perfect.
Well, that solves the problem that we were having before.
I knew you'd figure it
Cool.
out. Okay.
Until just now.
So I'll mute her again until we need her.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
Yep, that's awesome.
The Q&A then.
Hmm. So good afternoon and welcome to the Interfaith Study Group. My name is Gail Gendler and I am the chairperson of the Interfaith Study Group's Planning Committee. And I want to thank you again for joining us. We had over 60 people register for this webinar and I'm so grateful to you for making time to join us today. Before we begin, there's so many devastating and dangerous fires unfolding locally and throughout the Pacific Northwest. The local communities of Pasadena, Altadena, Sierra Madre, and Monrovia are some of those affected areas. We hope for those of you in these communities that you and your families are safe. I want to thank our first responders, in particular the brave firefighters working during this intense heat to help save our homes, our lives, the communities we love, and the forests. Today's topic, ironically, is climate justice. Leading the conversation for us are two local youth activists. They're Sarah Ricci and Chandini Agarwal. Both women, oops, I just lost my script. Sorry about that. Both women are high school students at Crescenta High School and leaders with the Youth Climate Strike LA and One Up Action. They're here to talk about the social costs of environmental degradation. These two women met on the streets of LA at a climate change protest and have since become strategic organizers, taking on leadership roles to help organize other local students. This is the Interfaith Study Group's second webinar. As you know, due to COVID-19, the Interfaith Study Group had to find a new way to meet. Instead of in-person monthly meetings, we are now hosting monthly Zoom webinars. This is our second webinar, so please excuse us for any technical difficulties. I do have a few pointers for those of you watching at home. Hopefully, right now you can see me and the two panelists. If not, you can select the speaker view, which is found on the upper right-hand corner of your screen. By selecting speaker view, you should be able to see everyone at once. This webinar is being recorded. Afterwards, if you would like a link, please email me. And when I'm finished with the intro, I'll put my email address in the chat area. If while Sarah and Chandini are speaking, you want to enter anything in the chat for them to see or other attendees to respond to, just use the chat function for that. If you have a question for the panelists, please post your questions in the Q&A area and we will relay questions to Sarah and Chandini. And the chat and Q&A areas are normally found at the bottom of the screen. And to a reminder to everyone at home, you actually control the audio level of your own device. So if you're having a hard time hearing, take a second to adjust your audio and do this now. I'm very excited for today's conversation. In a minute, I'll pass the virtual microphone to Sarah and Chandini to introduce themselves, and then I'm going to disappear during their presentation. I'll rejoin you at the very end. So with that, I am going to say Sarah and Chandini, please take it over and please unmute yourselves.
Hi, thank you so much for having us today. And like Gail said, right now with the fires going on, having this conversation is so important as we're seeing the effects right now. So yeah, we're just going to talk a little bit about the climate crisis. And yeah, so we'll start off by introducing ourselves. Chandini?
Hi everyone, my name is Chandini. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Director of Communications and Outreach at Youth Climate Strike Los Angeles, as well as a resource coordinator for One Up Action and an organizer with the campaign called California Youth versus Big Oil. I started organizing for the climate after attending the first youth climate strike on March 15th, 2019. I was so inspired by the small group of young people my own age who had organized the protest, and this was the first time I realized how much power young people have to create change. After the protest, I reached out to one of the organizers and joined Youth Climate Strike Los Angeles, where I've been organizing protests in LA ever since.
Hi everyone, my name is Sarah. My pronouns are she, her. I'm currently the Director of Operations at One Up Action, the Logistics Director at Youth Climate Strike LA, and an organizer at City Youth versus Big Oil. And we'll talk about that organization a little bit later. And I started climate activism in kind of an unconventional way. My friend just one day was like, hey, there's a climate strike, let's just leave school and go to it. So I went with him, and just hearing the frontline stories of the strike really inspired me and made me realize how important it was to get involved. And through that, I just started showing up to a lot of events and eventually became an organizer. And through the connections I made, I helped start One Up Action, which Chandi and I organize with, as well as we do work with CA Youth versus Big Oil. So yeah.
So today we're going to be talking about the climate crisis and why it's something that you should care about. So we'll start off with the basics, Climate Crisis 101, and then we'll move into an introduction to environmental justice and environmental racism. We'll talk about a more local perspective with some of the work Sarah and I have been doing with a campaign called CA Youth versus Big Oil. And then we'll end with some things you can do and a Q&A.
Okay, so we want to start off this conversation by giving a sense of where all of you are at. So if you want to answer this question in the chat, or you can raise your hand and we can unmute you. Just what do you think when you hear climate crisis? What particular issues come to mind? What images come to your head? So if you could type in the chat your answers, and also if you'd like to be unmuted and say something, we can definitely do that. So yeah, just want to see some answers. Forest fires, ocean levels rising, yeah. Extinction, yeah, we're in the 6th mass extinction event, so it's very pertinent. Global warming and fires, yeah. Fires is a big thing, that's what we're seeing right now. Rising sea levels, yeah. Is there any more? Glaciers melting, warmer temperatures. Yeah, so all of these answers are really good. They're definitely, I noticed that you guys are really focusing on the environmental side, water shortages, droughts. Yes, it's a big thing, hurricanes, tornadoes. Yeah, so everything that you guys have been saying is super accurate. These are all really important effects of the climate crisis. So yeah, I'm just gonna go into what our definition of climate change is. So we've defined it as the rapid warming of our global climate due to the greenhouse gas effect. And I'm just gonna assume that you guys know what the greenhouse gas effect is. And so that's a natural process that regulates our atmosphere, but humans have drastically accelerated the rate of this phenomenon because of activities such as oil drilling that have disrupted the carbon cycle, accelerating the greenhouse gas effect and causing rapid global temperature increase. And due to this, climate change poses an existential crisis to the future of humanity and all life on Earth. So kind of connecting back to what you said about the global extinction rates increasing. So these are some of the effects, and you guys mentioned some of these. So increased severe weather events like fires, like hurricanes, climate refugees and mass immigration due to thermal expansion of oceans and extreme droughts. So I did see that somebody mentioned sea level rising, and a common misconception about that is that there's glaciers melting and there's just more water in the ocean. The reality is that a lot of sea level rise is because warmer water expands. So that's causing island nations go underwater, which is causing mass migration, as well as severe weather events such as droughts, creating food insecurity, causing people to need to leave where they are, loss of biodiversity, especially in the ocean. There are a lot of people who rely on fish as their main food source, and as fish populations decrease, they need to find other sources of food. Ocean acidification, which is contributing to loss of biodiversity, increased pollution, and food and water insecurity. So yeah, those are some issues, effects of climate change. And if you guys have any questions about any of those, you can go ahead and put those in the chat and I can try to get them. But in addition to these effects, one of the really huge things is environmental injustice, which Chandni is now going to touch on.
Thank you, Sarah. So environmental justice is essentially acknowledging that the climate crisis does not impact everyone equally. Certain communities experience greater or more extreme effects of the climate crisis due to their location, lack of access to certain resources, among other things. So for example, Sarah touched on this a little bit, but many island nations, such as those in the Pacific Islands, are at risk because of sea levels rising and because of the loss of biodiversity that decreases the fish. That's a big part of their food supply. So they're experiencing some of the worst effects of the climate crisis, in spite of the fact that these nations are not giant industrialized powers, and so they have much less carbon emissions than, for example, like European countries or the United States, but they still are experiencing some of the worst effects of the crisis. So the environmental justice movement was started by Black and Indigenous communities and other communities of color because they are often the ones who are disproportionately being impacted by ecological and environmental devastation. Next slide. Okay, so here's a quote by Professor Robert Bullard that is a great summary of environmental racism and the need for environmental justice. He says, whether by conscious design or institutional neglect, communities of color in urban ghettos, in rural poverty pockets, or on economically impoverished Native American reservations face some of the worst environmental devastation in the nation. So like we talked about on the previous slide, environmental racism reveals itself in the US in the fact that low-income Black, Indigenous, and people of color are far more likely to live near fossil fuel infrastructure, toxic waste sites, etc. According to one study done by the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice, race is the single most important factor in determining where toxic waste sites are located in the US. The study shows that 15 million Black Americans, 8 million Hispanic Americans, and 50% of Asian and Pacific Islanders and Indigenous Americans live near toxic waste sites. Here, okay, so on this slide, we have some examples of environmental racism in California in the past few decades. So first is the Santa Barbara oil spill. In early 1969, a blowout of an offshore oil drill site led to the largest oil spill of the time. The spill killed a huge amount of marine life, and it raised a lot of public outrage. Because of this, it popularized environmentalism, and it resulted in numerous pieces of environmental legislation being passed within the next few years. Next, there's the Kettleman Hills Hazardous Waste Facility, the largest hazardous waste site, which is located next to Kettleman City in California, which is a city with a low socioeconomic average and over 95% Latinx residents. In 1988, a toxic waste incinerator was planned to be added to the facility, which would cause severe environmental and health impacts to the people in the surrounding area. Because of this, a community-led environmental justice movement testified and filed a lawsuit against the corporation that operated the waste facility. It was a huge win when the trial ruled in the favor of the people, and the plans for the incinerator were dropped. Unfortunately, environmental racism situations like this are fairly common, with corporations and government placing waste disposal sites in marginalized communities that are often less able to resist to the infrastructure being added. Next, there's the Chevron plant in Richmond, California, which is an ongoing example of environmental racism. Besides the health problems that are caused just by living in close proximity to the plant, many incidents at this plant have caused health problems in the surrounding area, which has a very large Black and Latinx population. For example, a 1999 explosion and fire at the plant leaked toxic and harmful gases into the community, making many residents very sick. The chemicals also contaminated the water supply and the soil in the area. Incidents like this continue to happen on the plant to this day. The other examples we have on this page all have a very similar story to the Chevron plant. The agricultural waste site in California's Salton Sea exposes residents of Riverside County and Imperial Valley to toxic pollutants. The numerous oil drill sites and oil refineries in Los Angeles, as well as the Kern River oil field and fracking, are exposing many mostly BIPOC neighborhoods to toxins that cause heart and lung disease, cancer, asthma, and many other health problems. As you can see, there are numerous examples of environmental racism in California. Next, Sarah is going to talk about a campaign that is trying to address these and fight for environmental justice across California.
Yeah, so thank you, Chandani, for touching on what environmental injustice is. And I know that concept might be really big and new for some people. It's not really the thing that you think of when you think of climate change. You usually think of hurricanes and fires, but really talking about how the climate crisis affecting communities might be a little bit new. So we're going to look at this issue locally through our campaign called CA Youth versus Big Oil, which is the campaign to try to phase out big oil within California and really protect communities of color who are facing the worst impacts of it. So this map here is of all of the fossil fuel infrastructure in California. And you can notice that it's really clustered near more low-income communities like in Kern County and South LA. I know that Assembly District 64, which is the Compton, Watts, North Long Beach area, holds 25% of the oil refineries in the nation. And those are majority people of color communities. So it's really evident that where these oil refineries are low income neighborhoods that are located where people don't really have the resources to fight back and get these oil refineries out of their communities. And the reason why it matters that these oil refineries and fossil fuel infrastructure are there is because they can cause really, really dramatic health impacts, including asthma, upper respiratory issues, reproductive health issues, rashes, headaches, nosebleeds, as well as increased cancer risk. And it's very much real when you live near these oil refineries. You do really feel the impacts of them. And 90% of the people in California living within a mile of these oil refineries are people of color. So it's very much targeted to people of color who are living in low-income communities. So our campaign, CA Youth versus Big Oil, has been trying to fight that. And the three ways that we're going about that is demanding that the governor do three things. One, stop all new fracking permits and oil drilling permits. Governor Newsom has continuously been approving new oil wells, not just maintaining the old ones, approving new ones. And as we see with the fires and all of the terrible impacts of climate change that are so evident around us, he still is approving new fracking wells, oil wells that increase the effects. The other thing is to begin a phase out of these oil wells and start transitioning to 100% renewable energy with a just transition that protects workers and communities. So we can't be approving more oil drills. We need to start phasing them out. And then the last goal is to set a 2,500 foot health and safety setback so that these oil drills cannot operate in densely populated areas near homes and hospitals, so these communities aren't feeling the health impacts. So this picture here is from our first strike, Youth Climate Strike Los Angeles and CA Youth versus Big Oil collaborated on this strike in November of 2019, and Greta Thunberg was actually there, so it was a really great opportunity to get a lot of media, and we promoted those three goals that I just mentioned. As you see on our banner here, it says, Governor Newsom, it's your last chance to choose our future or fossil fuels. So we're really trying to pressure the governor to sign an executive order to address these things. Yeah. And then this next slide just shows some other things that CA Youth versus Big Oil has been working on since. We have this petition here, Gavin Newsom and CalJam, which is the California oil and gas industry. So we had this petition, which we've gotten a lot of signatures. We've been sending emails and letters to the governor. We did this social media campaign to raise awareness, as well as several online webinars where we talked about how COVID-19 and the climate crisis are intersected. We talked about the Green New Deal and a just transition, intersectional organizing, and theories of change. So yeah, we have CA Youth versus Big Oil has been really grounded in communities and to center frontline and BIPOC voices in this conversation, so that we can raise awareness about the problem of neighborhood oil drilling in California and try to do something to it. Chandni?
Okay, so to end off, we want to talk about some things that you all can do to help make a difference. So a lot of the things that we have talked about in this presentation are systemic issues. So for example, we're not going to solve the climate crisis without a complete and just transition away from fossil fuels, along with many other systemic changes that need to take place. Here we have a list of individual actions that you can take in your own home, because every little thing makes a difference. But it's also important to keep in mind that the climate crisis will not be solved without systemic change. First, doing your own research is super important. Sarah and I gave just a short introduction to the climate crisis and to climate justice, but there is so much more to learn. So after this webinar, I think you will all be emailed with a list of resources that Sarah and I came up with, so you can do more research and watch videos about things such as sustainable agriculture, oil drilling, fast fashion. There's a lot of different things on that resources list. So speaking of fast fashion, stopping supporting the fast fashion industry is another one of our recommendations. Most clothes are produced very unsustainably, and they have a very large amount of carbon emissions, but many people are constantly buying new clothes that they don't need just to keep up with the ever-changing fashion trends. So boycotting the fast fashion industry can be very impactful. Third, reducing your consumption of animal products is also a great thing to do. The animal agriculture industry is responsible for a huge amount of carbon emissions globally because of the carbon produced by the animals, as well as deforestation that is done to make space for animal agriculture. So reducing the amount of dairy, meat, and especially red meat that you consume are very helpful to prevent a lot of those emissions. Next on this list is to donate to climate organizations, especially organizations led by Black and Indigenous people of color. This is super important to do because there are some amazing organizations that are working to address the climate crisis from the root of the problem and to make the systemic changes that we definitely need. So supporting them as much as possible is an incredible thing to do. And lastly, this one is super important, but to vote for climate progressive candidates. There are incredible candidates running for office at all levels of government who have really good climate plans to address the climate crisis and make the legislative and policy change that we need from within the government. So voting for those people is very, very important.
Yeah, thanks, Chandni. And so for the rest of our time, we're just going to do a Q&A. And so how it's going to work, you can either put your questions in the chat, and also if you want, if you'd like to say your question out loud, you can either raise your hand or maybe put like a little plus in the chat, and we'll get to those first and we can unmute you and you can say those out loud. So yeah, if anyone wants to raise their hand, we'll do those first and ask your questions. So. Until anyone wants to raise your hand, I'll just look at some of the questions that we already have. So define fast fashion. So what fast fashion is like Forever 21 or H&M and like stores like that sell really trendy clothes and are constantly getting in new styles. So the reason why that's bad is because in order to keep up with trends and get new shirts and things like that every week, they need to be producing an incredible amount of waste. They're throwing out a lot of the material that they're using, and usually their business models are really unsustainable and hurt workers. It's usually women from like India or Bangladesh who are being paid next to nothing, working in extremely hazardous conditions. So that's what fast fashion is. It's and so you can, instead of buying fast fashion, either buy secondhand or buy from sustainable companies.
I can
And
answer. Oh, good.
sorry, go ahead.
Here another question from the chat. So I see one that says, what leverage do these communities have to fight these issues? I think that was from when I was talking about the Kettleman City waste incinerator. The thing is, a lot of these communities often don't have the leverage to fight for these issues. There's often a language barrier for especially cities that are mainly people of color. If the information about the toxic waste sites is given only in English, then the people might not even know what the problem is until they're getting sick from it. So this is why that corporations and government strategically place things like toxic waste sites in communities of color, because they have the least leverage to fight the issues. The example I gave, they were so fortunate to have been able to come together and form that grassroots movement to fight against it, but often communities of color don't have that ability and that leverage.
Nasser, I've given you the ability to talk if you want to ask your question. I saw you had your hand raised. You should be able to unmute yourself.
Good. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, I wanted to thank you guys for an outstanding presentation. I thought that was really very nice and informative, and I'm very, very proud that you guys are doing that. So I just wanted to start with that. And then my question is about the things that we can do. And I like the list that you have, but one of the fundamental things that I wanted to ask if you can add to it is, as individuals, we could choose to use renewable energy by putting solar on our homes instead of using regular power, which is quite often oil power plants. And then the other is for transportation, to use electric vehicles, which is clean so that you don't have the exhaust that is going to contaminate the atmosphere and participate or contribute to the global warming, which has to do with the carbon emissions from these vehicles and other factories. So those are the two comments suggesting that you add for the things that we should do as participants.
Yeah, and thank you so much for bringing that up. And I think those things are definitely super important, and will make the most impact, like putting solar panels in your house and buying cars that don't use gas. Those things are definitely really important. I think the reason why we didn't include those specific things is because they require a certain amount of privilege to be able to do. And we really want to include things that anyone can do. And that kind of leads into a separate conversation about like where the responsibility is to solve the climate crisis, because putting solar panels in your house and trying to reduce your energy consumption or not buying fast fashion, things like that, all those things are really, really important and good to do as individuals. But it's also really important to recognize that those things aren't going to solve the climate crisis. The only way for us to truly solve the climate crisis is to have systematic change for the government to institute broad-based transition to clean energy. Because as individuals, yes, we can do all of these things and they're good and important, but we really need broad-based systematic change. And it's something that's like propaganda to try to say that it's the fault of the individual, it's our responsibility to do these things that oil companies have pushed for a really long time, saying that it's our job to fight the climate crisis. So I'm not sure if that makes sense, but
No, I think it makes sense. Thank you. So you're basically saying, well, not everybody can afford to put solar.
Yeah.
I do agree with you, although there are zero payment opportunities to do that with state, especially in California, incentives and so on. And I had posted a question related to ocean thermal expansion. I was wondering, did you mean to say the rising levels of water of the oceans, or is there something that I I'm not aware of.
Yeah, sorry, I probably could have explained that better, but thermal expansion and rising sea levels are basically the same thing. The concept of thermal expansion is basically that when water gets warmer, it expands. And so since the oceans are getting warm on a whole, the water is expanding and coming and flooding and things like that. So yeah, it's basically the same thing as sea level rise.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you. Well, thanks again. You guys are doing an outstanding job.
Thank you.
I'll go ahead and answer another question from the chat. So I see one that says, when is it possible to have 100% renewable energy in California? So in terms of when, it's pretty much as soon as our government leaders in California decide that they want to. As Sarah mentioned, Governor Newsom is continuing to issue new fracking permits instead of moving in the opposite direction. So he's not making progress in the right direction right now. As soon as our government leaders decide to take that step and start shutting down oil drilling sites and stop fracking and start investing in renewable energy, it can be a pretty fast change to renewable energy.
Thank you. Carl, I see you have your hand raised. So I'm going to try to allow you to talk so you can ask a question. Oh, it's not working. Give me 1 second. Okay, you should be able to speak now.
Yeah, hi. Thank you very much. This was a great presentation. I appreciate all of your hard work, and you're doing a great job of enlightening not only your fellow students, but all us old people. But you guys are the ones who are facing the world that we're leaving for you. And so you are really doing a great job of facing that crisis. I'd like to point out a couple of things. One is I very strongly support the all of the above approach, including individual actions of any kind, and that those actions do raise awareness and commitment by people to fighting climate change. Secondly, I'd like to turn your attention to work of organizations like the Citizens Climate Lobby, which is advocating and supporting bills in Congress like H.R. 763, which is a carbon fee and dividend reinvestment plan. So it would add a cost to carbon, including imports based on carbon economies outside of the U.S. And people who do not have means would get a monthly check to offset the added costs. And this would greatly reduce carbon use over time. So that, along with the Green New Deal, which is much more infrastructure oriented, are great things to support together. So I would, I'm going to be helping to organize the February Citizens Climate Lobby California conference in February, and I'll be in touch with you guys and see if there's a way we can join forces at that conference. Okay. Anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, I have heard of the Citizens Climate Lobby, and they have been doing really great work. Thank you so much for mentioning that. And the bill that you mentioned is a really, really great way to have more systematic change in addition to individual action. So just to clarify, we're not saying that don't do things as individuals. What we're trying to say is do those things are great, but we also need change on a systematic governmental level in addition. So yeah, thank you so much, Carl. Chandni, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. Okay. So someone asked, what are some specific BIPOC organizations you can support? Stand LA is a really amazing organization. They're doing a lot of work also about oil drilling in California because that is affecting BIPOC communities the most. So that's Stand-LA. And another really great organization is Communities for Better Environment. That's also a BIPOC-led organization doing work in LA. Those are just two I can think of off the top of my head, but there's definitely more. Maybe Sarah and I can add, I think we already added some of those in the resource document that you guys are going to get after this.
Yeah, thank you, Chandni. I think Community for Better Environment has definitely been doing a lot of really good work, and we're going to send around a resource sheet, and we'll add some really great organizations that you can support or donate to. Yeah, and going through the questions again, I don't see anyone else with their hand, so if you'd like to talk, you can do that. But one question is, as youth activists, do you feel that you have power with these protests and with Greta? So I think our power as youth activists really lie in our ability to draw attention to these issues. I think there's definitely something powerful about a bunch of kids being like, hey, we're in a crisis, please do something. But on a legislative level, it's really difficult because people, not just youth, people have been organizing for climate change for years. And so, yes, we as youth have power, but it's really up to you guys and everyone really to start mass mobilizing for climate change, because we really don't have any time left to really start this transition to renewable energy and start combating the climate crisis. We really need everyone to start mobilizing to vote for candidates who are going to champion climate policies, because we have no time to waste. And if we can't mobilize everyone, if you guys don't talk to your friends and convince them to vote for who will champion for climate change and do the things that we are suggesting, donate to organizations, we're not going to be able to achieve the things that we want to achieve. We really need mass mobilization, not just us youth activists.
Okay, I see a question that says, how do you feel about what's unfolding right now in the Pacific Northwest? What are the takeaways you have, and how should we adjust our lifestyle to navigate these intense fires? So, as I'm sure you all know, there are a huge number of fires all over the West Coast, from Washington to Southern California. And it's definitely a huge, major sign of the climate crisis. In terms of how I feel about it, it proves that this work that me and Sarah have been doing is super, super important, because we know that fires like this will only continue to get worse in the years that come until we start making progress away from fossil fuels and to solve the climate crisis. So I know that the fires that we're seeing now, it's not just the worst that we've seen in California, but it's the best that we will see within the next decade. Each year will only continue to get worse. What are the takeaways? Well, one thing that's significant about that is that the indigenous people of California have, before Europeans came to America, the indigenous people had practices where they would have controlled fires in order to protect the land from having these huge fires like we see now. So a big takeaway is that we need to listen to the indigenous people who have knowledge of the land and know how to take care of the land. That's super important to do, because they lived here for so many years, centuries before Europeans came, and so they have a lot of knowledge on how to take care of the land that our government leaders should be listening to.
Yeah, thank you, Chandni. I think your point about listening to the indigenous people when talking about land management is extremely, extremely important. So yeah, thank you for that. I'm trying to look through if there's any questions that we missed. And again, if you want to talk, please raise your hand. Earlier, someone asked if Governor Newsom has responded to our campaign, our City versus Big Oil campaign. And to my knowledge, he has not responded to anything that we've said. We've been sending him emails and letters, trying a meeting with him, and he has consistently refused to meet with us, despite all of our mobilization. And so we're hoping if we can get more people involved, more people aware of the issue, more people sending emails and pressuring him, we can really get him to start the transition to renewable energy. One thing I forgot to mention in the presentation is that us as California, we're seen as like a really progressive state and we're champions of climate policy, like we're doing everything right. But that's not the reality at all. We're actually, I think, the third largest oil producing state in the US. And as I mentioned before, it's really, really hurting communities. So it's really important that we do that. And so I'm really hoping that all of you, when we send out our follow-up document, you get involved with the campaign in some way. And yeah, let me just check again to see if anyone's raised their hand. I don't think so. So please raise your hand if you have any questions. And yeah, Chandani, do you want to?
Yeah, okay, so I see a question that says, as youth activists, do you feel that you have power with the protests, with Greta? So as a youth activist, I feel like a big message from youth activists is that we're not asking people to do what we say, because we're kids. Like me and Sarah are 17. A lot of youth activists are like still teenagers or very young. We're asking people to listen to the science, because obviously we're still learning. We don't know we're not experts in climate science. We're not experts in law. We're just asking people to listen to the experts, because there are infinite climate scientists out there who are saying the same thing and giving recommendations. And we need people to listen to them, because they know what we can do, what we need to do in order to solve the climate crisis. So I think that we do have power to inspire people, like in the way that the first climate protest I went to really inspired me to show me that what young people can do. And I think that's a super important thing. But our message is listen to the science.
Thank you. And then Nasser, I saw you had your hand up again. If you
yeah, actually, this is an area that I'm very passionate about, and I like that you guys are passionate, but I wanted to give you my 2 cents. If you step back and you look at the bigger picture, although I think in your presentation you want Governor Newsom to stop drilling and fracking, that by itself, at least in my opinion, does not affect the reduction of the carbon in the atmosphere or the carbon footprint, which is the real problem for the global warming. What can make a huge difference is if some of the power plants that are utilizing fossil fuel, whether it is oil or carbon, are replaced with renewable energy power plants. That makes a huge difference. Some of the factories that are utilizing fossil fuel would migrate to clean energy. Part of the fracking actually is, if you look at what that is, it is essentially to utilize natural gas as opposed to oil, which has a smaller carbon footprint. So I recommend that you kind of spend a little bit of time to look at, pick your battles, because if you say, stop drilling, that is in an environment where the state needs money, becomes problematic. But if instead you turn around and say, stop using fossil fuel power plants, then that is something that Newsom and others could do. And you look at the power plant companies, whether there are so many of them, they could make that as their strategy, and currently it's not. So my 2 cents.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I think part of the demands that Sarah was talking about, we're not just asking Newsom to shut down all fossil fuel infrastructure, we also want him to start a just transition to renewable energy. So we want renewable energy sources to replace fossil fuels, not just to get rid of fossil fuels, because that would obviously be bad for the economy, is to just completely cut that out. So
I agree with you, but did you know that the renewable energy incentive is going to end by the end of this year, which is essentially paying for 1/3 of the cost of renewable energy. It's going to end by the end of this year. So one of the things you can do is to say, you need to continue the incentive and increase it so that you would encourage people to utilize solar, for example.
I think our perspective is that it's not just enough to encourage people to use solar. I think obviously continuing that incentive is really, really important, and we should be doing whatever we can as individuals. But again, a lot of people don't have the money to get solar panels. And so it shouldn't be the job of the individual to pay for that, even if there is certain incentive. It should be the job of the governor to start a transition away from relying on fossil fuels, relying on more renewable energy, so that it's not the job of the consumer to buy solar panels. It's the job of the government to start creating renewable energy plants with solar and wind and things like that.
Excellent. Just put that in your charts. I didn't see anything about wind or renewable energy power plants and getting rid of fossil fuel based power plants. If you can add that to your charts, that would be great.
Yeah, what we meant by just transition is a transition away from fossil fuels to renewables.
Very well. Thank you.
Thank you. And then Kyle, I gave you the ability to talk, so you can answer your question. We can answer your question.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay, I posted this in the Q&A too, I think anonymously, but I thought I'd raise my hand and ask because we're all socially distanced and every bit of humanity might be able to help. But I'm a teacher and I'm always so encouraged by the ideas and the ingenuity of my students. So, seeing your passion is awesome. And I just love to hear maybe a little more that you haven't mentioned, like some things you did mention about having relationships with indigenous communities and people, about taking care of the land is such a wonderful idea. But as you two young dreamers dream about a sustainable world, are there other like details or what does it look like? Do cities look different? What does the marketplace economy look like? Or just anything like that? What do you dream of?
Yeah. Well, I think the biggest thing is having all of our energy come from renewable sources, like wind, solar, all the things we mentioned before, renewable energy, hopefully better public transportation, especially in LA. As well as, like you mentioned, agriculture, a really big increase in organic and sustainable agriculture. So the food we eat isn't having such a big impact, as well as just a reduction in animal products, because that's one of the biggest things in regards to food that has a carbon footprint, as well as just single-use plastics and things like that. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, so definitely all of what Sarah said. Also, another important thing is increased public transportation. We would love to see high-speed trains going everywhere, decrease of just single-person cars because public transportation is more sustainable. Things like community gardens, just everything to making communities like more community-based community gardens, things like that also contributes to a sustainable future. Yeah, really like what Sarah said. I agree with all of that.
Another thing maybe is more like building up instead of out. So getting rid of like urban sprawl, so more people can live in a more dense area and we're not encroaching on lands and we allow more nature.
Yeah, and also like to stop deforestation, obviously, but then also start restoring a lot of the forests and natural habitats that have been destroyed, to restore those so that they can come back and we can have those beautiful places in nature thriving again. I see a question in the chat that says, some individuals deny the science related to climate change. How do you suggest people respond to people who deny the science, and how can that conversation advance? That is a really great question. There's this amazing website that I often look at. It's called skepticalscience.com. I put the link in the chat. But this website gives people, it shows you a lot of the arguments that climate deniers make, as well as what the science says that to disprove the denial. So there's a lot of climate deniers who are saying like, oh, the climate's always changing, or there's all sorts of arguments. I would highly recommend looking at this website. It has a lot of really great information.
Just looking in the chat, I want to highlight some of the things that Sarah said, because I just read them. They're really great. You guys might have seen them already, but she said that H&M and Zara are two of the biggest fast fashion brands. So like I said before, those are the type of brands that are constantly putting out new trends, and so it creates a lot of waste. And she also mentioned greenwashing, which that's definitely a really big thing. Greenwashing is essentially taking a really unsustainable product and making it look like it's super good for the environment, like recycling programs or things like that. I'm trying to think of some other examples, Chauncey, if you want to help me out. But yeah, saying like, oh, this is so environmentally friendly, but in reality, it's just a marketing tactic and doesn't actually do anything that helps the environment. So yeah, thank you so much for putting that, Samira.
Wait, can I add on?
Yeah, go ahead.
So this isn't exactly fast fashion, but it's the same idea of greenwashing, where a lot of corporations try to make things seem environmentally friendly, or like they use phrases, but in reality, it's kind of like propaganda to make you think it's real. So for example, like a lot of public transportation, it'll be like, oh, it's natural gas. That doesn't mean anything. Like natural gas is still a fossil fuel, but it makes people who might not know as much about fossil fuels think like, oh, it's natural, it's good. So that's a form of greenwashing, and it's similar to what happens in the fast fashion industry.
Yeah, and it was also said that a large population lives in rental housing, so they can't choose to put solar in their homes. And thank you for mentioning that, because that relates to what I was saying before about a lot of these individual actions require a certain amount of privilege. Like if you've heard of the zero waste movement, of people like swapping out all of the disposable plastic in their house for reusable stuff, it takes a certain amount of privilege and money to do these individual steps, and that's why systematic change is so important, because the government, it shouldn't be the responsibility of the individual to solve the climate crisis. It really should be the corporations that like need to be regulated by the government. So yeah, thank you for mentioning that people who are renting don't have the privilege or the opportunity to put solar panels in their house or take individual actions like that.
Okay, I see a question that says, where do we research the proper people to vote for? So I don't know any websites off the top of my head where it just tells you. Sarah and I can research that a little bit and include if we find anything on the resource document that you're going to get after. But you can always look up like whoever's running for your congressional district, your state assembly district, governor, mayor, like all of those. And you can go, all of them have their own website where it says issues, and you can see what they say about climate change and the environment. You can also see who they're endorsed by. Often people who have been endorsed by the Sunrise Movement or ACLU, those two organizations endorse people who have really great plans in terms of climate and other important issues. So if you see an endorsement by them, it's usually a good candidate to vote for.
Yeah. Or like Our Revolution or DSA LA, those are really good endorsements. I think generally when looking at candidates in your own, like on your ballot, if they're endorsed by corporations, by super PACs, they're usually going to prioritize those people, those organizations. And so like seeing like who candidates take money from is a really good reflection on their values, because if they're taking it from the fossil fuel industry, then they're going to make legislation that protects the fossil fuel industry. But if they're getting their money from grassroots organizations and getting small donations, that indicates that they value people and communities. I want to talk a little bit about one candidate that I'm helping on her campaign. Her name is Fatima Iqbal Zubair, and she's actually going to be, if elected, she'd be the first Muslim woman in the California state legislature. And she's running to represent District 64, which, as I mentioned, has 25% of the oil fields in they have 25% of the oil drills in California, including some of the largest oil fields, I think the third largest oil field in the continental US, all really near densely populated communities of color. And she is refusing to take any money from fossil fuels, whereas her opponent is taking a lot of corporate PAC money. So if you live in that district, then she's a really good person to support. And even if there's no one in your, oh, thank you. Samia just put the link for Fatima in the chat, but even if you don't live in that district, which I don't, but I've been working as an intern for her, you can donate or you can phone bank for her and get her elected, because I mean, what happens in that district affects all of us in terms of fossil fuels, and it's really important that we elect people who value people over corporations. But yeah, it's really important that you all do your own research, and I think that we're running out of time. Gail, I don't know how many more questions that we can take.
I know both Cecilia sent a question in and Carl that are both in the chat pod. If you can maybe scroll through, that would be awesome. And then after those two, I think that would be, we can wrap it up.
Okay.
Just scroll way down if you don't mind.
To the bottom.
553, there's one from Carl. Or just a comment, actually. But Cecilia said, I'll read it. How about that? Yeah, Cecilia said, unfortunately, some individuals deny the science related to climate change. How do you suggest people respond to those people who deny the science? How can that conversation advance?
Chandani, if you want to speak on this a little bit, but at a certain point, it's just like there's so much overwhelming evidence to prove what we're talking about. So if like you can try to show them as much research as possible and explain these things, but at a certain point, if people are just unwilling to accept the truth, then there's not much you can do about it. But instead, I think a more productive way of going about like talking to your friends is, instead of trying to convince people who deny science that science is real, I think that might just be an unproductive conversation. Some people are just unwilling to listen. I think it'd be a lot more productive to go to people who do understand that climate change is real and get them to do something about it, get them to donate their time, their money, and to really join the movement. I think that's what's going to change things.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Sarah. I think I did drop the link to Skeptical Science in the chat before, which is a website that has a lot of the arguments of climate deniers. I also definitely agree with what Sarah said. This is part of why we need systemic change and can't just rely on individuals taking action, because not every individual is going to agree, and there's nothing really we can change about that. So we need to change the systems and the infrastructure and all, like it has to start from the systems and not just individuals. So yeah.
And then, Gail, you said there was one more question you wanted us to answer?
I'm sorry, I'm going to scroll through. From Nasser, a walk in nature is a spiritual experience. How does nature connect you to your faith?
I think that's kind of a difficult question, but I think, at least for my climate activism, just being around nature is something that motivates me, and it makes me want to do things. And also just, you can see God in nature so clearly in the beauty of it. Yeah, Chandni, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I definitely agree. Like seeing the beauty of nature, and like that's really what inspires me to want to protect it and take action so that we don't lose all of the beautiful nature that's all around us. So yeah, definitely I agree with what Sarah said.
And sorry, really quick, I just want to answer the last question in the chat about cars, saying that some people can't afford electrical cars. I think that really relates to the things you were saying before about privilege and who can take these individual steps and not. And so what I'd say to you, to the person who asked this question, just it's not your fault that the system is set up in the way that it is, where we have to drive gas cars and we have to use energy in our houses from unsustainable sources, because some people just don't have the privilege to take those steps, and that's not your fault. And so the best thing you can do is try to support organizations who are working to change the system, support candidates who are trying to change the system, because if we all try to take that responsibility on ourselves and try to change every little thing, you literally go crazy, because the system is not set up for you to be perfect and for you to not make an impact. It's going to happen regardless. So trying to take more systematic steps rather than just trying to change your life, it takes the guilt off of you and puts it on the system where it should be. So yeah, I think that is it. Thank you guys so much for listening and asking questions. Really appreciate it. And yeah.
Thank you all so much for joining.
I want to thank both you guys, Sarah and Chandani. I think you shared your information with such enthusiasm and passion, and actually for a lot of, I'm speaking for many of the attendees, you have a very different perspective as youth organizers than maybe many of the attendees. So I think it's really important to see the full spectrum from all age groups, and you bring such dynamic and thoughtful ways about what you're doing. It's been great. So if anyone's questions were not answered during this, I just want to say we had a number of them, so it's hard to get every question answered during a program. We did record this, and if anyone would like a copy, I did put my email in the chat, and I can do it right at the end. Next week, we will be sharing some follow-ups with you, the presentation that was shared today. And in addition, there is this document that has a lot of ways in which you can become involved, and I think that will be a great resource for how you can take action and continue your own learning. The next Interfaith Study Group webinar will be Sunday, October 11th from 5 to 6 p.m. And that webinar will focus on nature as a sacred space. So be on the lookout for that invite next week. And again, just be sure to RSVP to reserve your spot for that. And on behalf of the Interfaith Study Group, I'd love to extend my thank you to, again, Sarah and Chandani for joining us today, and for all of you for making time to be with us for this hour. Do you guys want any final words? You just unmute yourselves, and then that'd be great.
Yeah, if I had anything last to say, I think just do whatever you can, wherever you can, donate where you can, volunteer your time. And it really is going to take all of us giving as much as we can to really make a difference.
Yeah, definitely. Like, this is an existential crisis. It's the future of our entire planet. So everyone can make a difference in a different way. So whatever you can do it. And yeah, thank you all so much for joining.
Well, thank you really for leading the way for us today. And with that, I want to thank you everyone for joining us, and I'll sign out for all of us. Have a great rest of the weekend and be safe out there. Thank you.
Thank you.